57talk.com. Gary Cubetta back again, Scottsdale, Arizona, and my pleasure to introduce someone I've wanted to interview for quite some time, the great Jim Cornette. Jim, pleasure to have you with us.
Gary, thank you very much for asking me. It's a pleasure to be had.
Well, you are here. Now, I want to ask, you got your new website up, www.jimcornette.com?
That's correct.
That's correct, and I know you're not very proficient with the web, but I've been nice site, very well designed, and you've got some of your personal collection for sale up there, just a little here and there. What made you decide to embrace the internet?
Well, it was a series of events that came together in a perfect storm. I've always been anti-technology because I just couldn't figure out how to work the thing. But when I started working on my Midnight Express 25th anniversary scrapbook, which came out this past April, has got some tremendous reviews from some very heavy people in the wrestling industry, which you can go to jimcornette.com and read some of those comments. I was working on the scrapbook and wanted to at the same time not only have a place to sell that, but also I just started hearing about and seeing and reading so many other guys' pages that I thought it was a great way to communicate with the fans if I could just find somebody that could actually put it up, and fortunately I did. My technological skills are limited. I'm a creative genius. But I put the website up, and it's kind of a two-part website. JimCornette.com has my Cornette's commentary columns and different news and bios and photos of my career and et cetera. So that's all about Jim Cornette. And then you can go to the collectibles portion, Cornette's Collectibles, which is kind of like another website within my website. And you can not only buy the Midnight Express book and DVDs, you can also buy my autographed pictures. And also, I finally started over the past year and a half, the paring down of my massive wrestling collection that I've had for 40 years. I got a pretty big house, and over half of it is wrestling, and I'd like to be able to get to my closet one of these days.
And Jim, that's what I'd like to ask. What does your collection look like? Because I see little bits and tiny pieces up on the site, and I'm thinking selling piece by piece, but I know I've spoken with a lot of people off the air that you've just got a tremendous amount of stuff. Well,
believe it or not, Gary, actually, and I was at the Charlotte Fan Fest with a huge triple-wide booth, Cornette's Collectibles, and people say, well, you're selling your stuff. Actually, no, it is my stuff, but right now I've gone through and I'm selling duplicates and triplicates and things that I don't need, and people said, you've got all this stuff. I said, what I had in Charlotte is about a fifth of what I'm going to eventually put up on the site. For 40 years, not only, running wrestling companies, but writing programs all the way back to the Memphis days in the late 70s and 80s, I would get handfuls, stacks of magazines, stacks of programs, keep paperwork, buy boxes of different things at wrestling conventions. And finally, I decided to put it in some type of order, and I've got things that most people have not even seen publicly before relating to wrestling that's going to come out with inside paperwork and things like that. But I've listed over the summer classic magazines from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, programs. I still have, of course, my collection of wrestling photos that I took in the Tennessee territory in the late 70s and early 80s, and that's going to be the subject of my next book, hopefully out in the spring, a classic wrestling photo book. So I'm still keeping my prized possessions, but I've got to get some room in my house, and I'm letting this stuff out for the first time, and people are snatching it up because you just can't find it anymore. Oh. And most of my stuff is in pretty pristine condition.
Okay, so you say people are snapping it up, and in the past people have said that wrestling memorabilia hasn't had a real value compared to maybe some other sports or activities, movies or whatever. Are you finding that people are willing to shell out the money for this stuff?
Well, for one thing, my prices are pretty reasonable. Everything on the site, whether it be photos, magazines, programs, my Midnight Express book, whatever, DVDs, goes for between $5 and $25. Now, there have been some few autographed items like mint condition Starrcade 86 programs and a couple of David Von Erich and memorial programs from Tech Stadium in the 80s that were autographed that have been higher. But most of the price is pretty reasonable because I'm not selling the treasure trove that I have. I have a few items that could probably get some attention. We talked about one of them before we went on the air. But for $15 or $10 to have one of these classic 60s or 70s magazines in really nice shape and a collector's bag with your favorite wrestler on the cover, I mean, to me, why not? And I think that's been borne out when you go to the dealer shows, and especially the Charlotte Fan Fest. There was some really nice stuff there this year, and people want the memories of their favorite wrestlers and the wrestling they grew up on. And unfortunately, as far as wrestling we grew up on, that's all we've got these days is memory.
Yeah, indeed. I watched that. What's your exact involvement with Ring of Honor right now, Jim?
Well, as a matter of fact, in the middle of September, obviously, I took the position with Ring of Honor as executive producer of the television program. And, I've told people that when you're an executive producer producer in Hollywood, that could mean anything from you wrote a check and did nothing else to you wrote the whole thing and got the whole thing shot and produced the whole thing. I'd like to be somewhere in the middle. They've given me kind of free rein to kibitz. I'm going to make my first TV taping November 5th and 6th in Philadelphia, and I just want to see if there's anything, I've been doing television wrestling for over 25 years now. If there's anything that I can do to help the television program or the promotion in general. I've also spent the best part of the past 10 or 12 years training young guys, young talent, whether it be in Ohio Valley Wrestling or working with them in TNA. And I'd like at the same time to do some of that because Ring of Honor to me has a tremendous talent roster. It's got a great style. It's an alternative. It's different. It's more athletically based and athletically oriented. These guys work their butts off, and I think Ring of Honor can be taken to the next level. And fortunately, there are no creative problems, unlike at TNA, to prevent Ring of Honor from getting bigger. They genuinely want to, and they do the best they can with the resources available to them. So I'm excited about it. I'm making appearances at the house shows, meet and greet, just doing whatever I can to increase ROH's visibility.
Jim, nobody's worked with as many different promotions you have in the last 20 years. Are you a believer that it will always be Vince and WWE on top, or do you think there is an opportunity, if someone did the right thing, for something to sweep the nation and for Vince to get toppled from that number one slot?
Well, I mean, you never say always, but it's going to be quite a while just by sheer size and force before anybody can top the WWF, WWE, whatever they're calling themselves these days to stay ahead of the law. But that doesn't mean that there's not room for an alternative. That doesn't mean there's not room. And once again, if you're making money and you're successful, does it matter whether you're number one or you're number two or you're number three, as long as you're successful doing what you're doing? The thing is, there is no alternative in wrestling to Vince McMahon's style of the WWE, the sports entertainment. There could have been with TNA. That's why I signed on, but unfortunately they hired that other guy right after I got there who has blocked every effort to present any kind of alternative, different programming, and instead wants to do sports entertainment because that's all he knows, and he doesn't really know that. Of course, I'm talking about Vince Russo. The problem is with everybody, with the UFC and mixed martial arts, the hottest sport right now in the world, with Dana White kicking Vince McMahon's ass on pay-per-view, nobody has yet figured, especially the company that's on Spike Television with UFC, hey, if we gave people an adult, logical, sensible, athletically based, credible product instead of the hoo-ha of sports entertainment, why, maybe they'd watch our program. It's stunning to me that they can't figure this out. But as a result, they haven't because, that's not what Vince Russo is going to do. He doesn't know anything about anything related to sports except he's a big baseball fan. He just doesn't like wrestling. So that's why he writes wrestling for people who don't like wrestling. Unfortunately, the people who don't like wrestling aren't watching.
Jim, you really don't have to tell us anything about Vince that we don't already know. Because,
well, I mean, I know everybody knows it, but it just...
I'll tell you, I saw him in 1998 or 99 with WW. He put the world championship on himself, and he put it on David Arquette, and that's all we need to know about him. And the sooner he's out of the business, the better.
Everybody used to complain about bookers that put the title on themselves, but at least they actually were wrestlers first.
And Jim, forget Russo, because honestly,
I've been trying. I've been trying for 10, 15 years now. I moved halfway across the country 10 years ago to get away from him. Every time I go to a Russo free zone, he seems to turn up like mold on a shower curtain.
Has anyone given you an opportunity in the last 50 years? I've spoken to a lot of people about you, and they all tell me how talented you are in the business, and I've followed you myself. Has anyone given you a real opportunity to use that talent, or is it always with handcuffs on?
Well, no, actually, I had 6 wonderful years here in Louisville booking Ohio Valley Wrestling. It was actually, Dave Meltzer said that it was oftentimes the best weekly episode of wrestling television in this country on a shoestring budget with talent that very seldom had made a name yet. But it was simply pro wrestling under pro wrestling rules, presented logically without apologies, with credible conflicts between guys who were trying to make it big in the wrestling business, and people bought tickets and watched the television show to see who was going to win matches. That's kind of really basically the gist of the whole thing. It's just that everybody's...
Jim, that's a local... We've had WCW come and go. Well, came long...
Oh, yeah, but see, here's the thing. When you get to national wrestling, Gary, when you get to corporate wrestling, it's going to be all screwed up regardless. And it's also going to be the vision of the one guy in charge. And, Vince McMahon, whether you like it or not, at least he had a vision. WCW had no vision. TNA has stigmatism in their vision. And so, in answer to your question, yes, my talents were used, and I had quite a good time doing it with Ohio Valley Wrestling because it was a program that I could put my name and my face on and be proud of. of and not have people laugh at, like, look at that silly stuff. All that wrestling's fake. That just burns me up. So, yes, but unfortunately then I made the mistake of being too closely aligned with the WWF as far as contracting for their developmental program. And when Jim Ross stepped aside in favor of John Laurinaitis, he micromanaged or tried to our business that we owned and paid the bills on here in Louisville, which led to a lot of the blow-ups, which led to me deciding that a McMahon-free life was probably going to be longer and more pleasurable, especially with my blood pressure.
Well, a McMahon-free life. Aside from OVW, did Vince ever allow you to use any of your ideas on a national basis?
Well, I mean, when I was on the creative team up there, obviously, ideas that I had got over, as a matter of fact, or got through, I should say, through the filtering committee. The Hell in the Cell match was actually my concept. There's probably a few other things that people would remember and people would know of that I, managed to get through in the WWF. But it's always Vince's vision, and I spent, I guess, the first 6 months I worked on the creative team there having Bruce Pritchard tell me what we couldn't do because Vince wouldn't like it.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, wait a minute, how do you know he won't like it? Oh, we've tried all that. Well, you haven't tried it. Well, no, we've tried all that. Here's what he likes. And see, basically, they hired dentists, and then they put them to work as shelf stockers, not what they were hired for, because if you don't do what Vince does or wants done, then it doesn't count.
Have you dealt with Vince a lot, one-on-one?
Not for years. I don't know where his head's at now.
Okay.
I dealt with him one-on-one too much between 1996 and 1999. That's why I still have a slight twitch.
Yeah. What is he like? What was he like back then, Deal? He's been in charge of wrestling really for so long. I just wonder how it's affected his mental. And
I do know that when I moved down here in '99 and stopped seeing him on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I know that he's a lot crankier now with his television announcers and overall with his writing staff and everything. He wasn't a big yeller then. Now I know he's a yeller. I hear he's a yeller, and he didn't really yell at a lot of people then. But of course, by the same token, everybody knew what he would do if they didn't do what he wanted them to do. It's almost impossible to describe Vince McMahon, who's a complicated individual, on the telephone, but I'll say this. This is what I've summed it up as before. If you work with, for, or closely around Vince McMahon, you will love him at some time. You will hate him at other times. Often those times will be at the same times. He will do great things for you, and he will piss you off extremely. And sooner or later, your blood pressure will go up, and you will get an antisocial tendency.
Yeah, I think I know it. So it's an extremely complex relationship, to say the least.
Let me tell you, Sigmund Freud could come back from the dead and spend years analyzing Vince McMahon, and I think Sigmund would be the one that would be committed at the end of it.
Jim, if one of the group were to allow you to run free, like they have allowed Vince Russo to run, and you actually use your ideas, how certain are you that they would work today? Because people have changed. I'm not saying the business should have changed, but the mind of the people has changed quite a bit. Do you think that what you would want to do would draw?
Well, here's the thing. I don't understand what the controversy is. Basic human emotions never change. Happy, sad, mad, glad, hate, fear, jealousy, revenge, glory, all that whole thing. All I'm advocating, all I've ever advocated, is stop insulting the fans' intelligence by presenting guys on your program who are beating each other up and saying they hate each other, and then sending them out to do television talk shows where they're slapping each other on the back. John Wayne didn't shoot all those Indians, but he didn't help them up off the ground and dust them off on camera. Secondly, a little logic and a little credibility. Treat your talent like athlete. Present it like a sport, because that's the basis of what wrestling is. It's the oldest sport in the world. I know you've got to have a little entertainment, a little flair. That's where the talent comes into play, because if you have entertaining talent that are unique, charismatic personalities that people are predisposed to like or to dislike, that's where the entertainment comes from in wrestling. It's only when people from outside the business or people who want to try to remake the business have gone into this sports entertainment state. And it was a fad for a while, and it worked. The ice cream bars and everything sold. But the problem is now, that was 10 years ago. People are buying UFC. People are buying conflict between guys who are legitimately not only athletic but competing. It's not about the funny skit. Wrestlers are bad actors, notoriously bad comedians, but they're great athletes. They should be allowed to do what they best. And what I advocate is simply taking professional wrestling with the rules that have always existed for wrestling, and in a logical and credible way present new talent, not guys that are 40, 50 years old that have been on top 20 years, but new talent in that mix. That's what I did with OVW. That's what most successful promotions do, is present new faces and good talent in situations that people can buy into and believe emotionally, and that's where they buy tickets to see what's going to happen. You know, Vince Russo, you say, well, Cornette's stuck in the 80s. No, what I was stuck with the 80s idea of having wrestling make sense and having a reason for people to buy a ticket to want to see what's going to happen. But I wanted to do it with stars that were born in the 80s, not the stars that were on top in the 80s. And the problem is, now Vince Russo is stuck in 1997, and he can't stop repeating the same things. I mean, you can sit there and watch his television. He does the same things that worked 10 years ago. The problem is, 10 years ago was the middle of a boom period with big stars like Steve Austin and The Rock, and anything was going to work. It's well known in wrestling, if you're hot, anything works. If you're cold, almost nothing works. So now he's doing the same thing, recycling the same stuff, burning through angles, getting nobody over, shooting things left and right without any resolution to them. Nobody knows who's on whose side. Nobody knows who the bad guys and good guys are. Nobody knows why the guys are fighting. It's an endless array of screaming and yelling and people throwing things at each other. And it's just like the Peanuts parent. You can't understand what they're saying because it's all wah, 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 just coming at you 100 miles an hour for no rhyme or reason. And once again, pretty much everybody in the business, I mean, you know, people as diverse as Jerry Jarrett and Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan and myself, I mean, there's 4 different people. Everybody knows. The people that work with him know Vince Russo does not know what he's doing. When his formats are read aloud, they shake their head, they roll their eyes.
Jim, hold on.
Yes.
You don't need to tell us
but here's
Russo
what I'm saying. The one talent that Vince Russo has that has blocked the progression of professional wrestling into some alternative program to Vince McMahon is that he can sell himself to people that make the decisions better than anything I've ever seen. Because how else do you explain it? A guy with no success at what he's tried to do ever, but still he gets chance after chance.
Well, I think the people in charge are stupid, BASTARDS. What do you want me to tell you?
And you can spell too, Gary.
Yeah, but look, here's what it comes down to, Jim, and I want to ask again, and I agree with you on Vince Russo. I don't watch TNA. Most of the audience doesn't watch TNA, which is an amazing case. They are the natural competitor to WWE. They've got the most tools, and we don't watch, so there's a reason for that. But my question to you again is, why doesn't someone give a chance? What's happened? I mean, you've had the incredible life. Why haven't you had the chances that Vince had?
Well, I don't play politics, and I don't play well with others. I don't get along with people who either lie to me or basically exhibit signs of being stupid.
Yep.
You know, to me, I don't understand the problem. If I'm running a business, and I wanted people who would do the best job they could no matter what. Instead of, I wanted people who would do the best job that I would tell them to do or allow them to do. I don't understand why that it's got to be that way, but politics plays a huge part in pro wrestling, and everybody knows that. And I don't do it very well because I don't have a lot of patience with people that are either crooked or stupid, and that takes into account a lot of people. Well, actually, that takes it. If you walk down the street, I would imagine 7 out of 10 people you encounter are going to be either crooked, stupid, or both. You know, I can't.
Is it worse?
I can't lie to get ahead. I've never done that well.
Is it worse today than it was 20 or 25 years ago? Because it seems to me in wrestling, for example, that back then, good decisions, someone who made good decisions would be in demand. They would be given an opportunity. But from what you're telling me and what I see, a guy like Vince Russo, and, you know, we can say anything we want about Russo, and we agree to begin with, but they seem to get the opportunity. Do you think society's changed where a guy like yourself, it's just a struggle to get that opportunity because you don't kiss ass?
Well, no, it's not that society has changed, just people running the wrestling business have changed. Whereas before, professional wrestling was maintained by all the regional promoters, and what was good for wrestling was good for them, and what was good for the wrestling in their area was even better for them, and they watched over it, and they took care of it, and they knew it from being in the business for 20 and 30 and 40 years, what the fans wanted to see, what the fans bought, the talent they could get over. Once that wrestling got out of, I've always said professional wrestling these days is the only business in the world where the people that produce the product know less about it than the people that buy the product. Wrestling went away from the control of the ex-wrestlers and, you know, the promoters to the corporate world. Started with Ted Turner, with TBS, who who did a lot of damage in the late 80s, early 90s to wrestling. Vince got involved in the steroid scandal, and his mind was elsewhere, and wrestling took a dive. And in 1995, every wrestling promotion in the country lost money, including Vince McMahon. He lost $6 million in 1995. It was a huge wrestling recession. Well, something had to be done. Well, Vince Russo's idea right at that time, when Vince McMahon was most vulnerable, was to hotshot the Attitude Era. Let them cuss. Let them show their boobies. Let them do all these things that wrestling had never done on television before, and naturally people started watching it because it was outrageous. And hotshotting goes back in wrestling as old as the hills. When you hotshot, you give them everything. You give them brawls. You give them blood. You give them heat. You give them wildness. And hopefully they will come back and get hooked on the program. Well, that's what happened in effect. They came back and they happened to see the emergence of the two biggest stars of modern times, Steve Austin and The Rock. And that hooked them on the program. And like I said, that goes back to then you could do whatever you wanted because wrestling was hot and it didn't matter. It was going to be hot. That's where Russo's writing got over. His writing was underneath the two biggest stars of the modern era, so it didn't matter what he was doing. It was still going to work. And he hopped on Rock and Austin's back and rode their coattails into some kind of reputation. But unfortunately now, between the corporate world having gotten involved, Vince McMahon wanting to remake the business into some kind of Harlem Globetrotters in a wrestling ring, and now the corporate world with, let's face it, the people in TNA 6 years ago had no experience in wrestling whatsoever. They started from scratch. And so they don't understand. They think they ought to be following the industry leader because that's what worked. They don't understand that something else would work as an alternative because that's what the NWA was to the WWF for all those years, and both had tons of fans. So basically, it's like if you took NASA out of control of the scientists and put the guy down at the Jiffy Lube in charge, he probably wouldn't make the best decisions about the moon rockets, even though he'd know how to change the oil in them.
Well, Jim, I agree. I think the idea of just copying Vince, take Vince's leftover talent, is just an obvious loser. And again, I'm going to ask, let me ask you this. You think, before you hang it up in the business, that someone's going to give you the opportunity? Because I agree with your base concept of wrestling, as does any real wrestler. Do you think someone's going to give you that opportunity, or is it something you're obviously not sure of? Do you think a good chance you'll get that opportunity?
Well, I don't know, and I'm not really looking for it, except the one I've got with Ring of Honor, because, like I say, I want to help a small company get bigger. Yeah. I want to help these guys take advantage of the tremendous fan base they've got and spread that around. But at the same time, I'm not saying it needs to be me. I'm saying it needs to be somebody. I don't know whether I've got the energy anymore to do whatever. I'm micromanaged. I've got the OCD. Yeah. When I'm in charge of a television program, even a local one like here in Louisville or the regionally syndicated Smoky Mountain Wrestling Show, everything that happens, I have had a finger in, whether it be booking the matches or arranging the formats or writing the voiceover copy for the commercials. I don't know that I have that energy, but I know for a fact that an alternative would work because I meet the fans and have for years. I get the email. We hate wrestling. It's too cartoon. It's too Hollywood anymore. We miss the wrestling we used to watch. Or the younger people say they will watch the old tapes from the 80s of Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat or the Horsemen or the Midnight Express or whatever and say, gosh, the people were going crazy in the crowd and the wrestling was so good and we really liked those personalities and we really thought they were mad at each other. Nobody gets that today. So it's just a question of, is anybody going to have the sense to say, well, every restaurant in the country is serving hamburgers. I believe I'll fix some chicken.
I think that's what it does come down to. There is an alternative, and the alternative has worked. The alternative is UFC. Now,
exactly. In 5 years, they have started tripling and quadrupling Vince McMahon's pay-per-view buy rates in this country. Explain that to me. Explain that one, Lucy.
Well, it's pretty obvious. Now, the question remains, is an alternative in wrestling, a pure wrestling environment? I think it's definitely viable. The question is, will someone with the money or in charge, will they give it a chance? And I think that's a big question going forward that only time will tell.
And that's what broke my heart about TNA, because they had all the tools. They had the monthly pay-per-views, the national television, the licensing, the talent roster. They have everything they need except a guy in charge who has any idea of what the fans want to pay to see.
Did you ever take, and I'll let you go pretty soon here, Jim, because I know you're on a short time schedule. Did you ever take Dixie aside and try and talk with her, or is that not your thing?
Well, here's the thing. I said this one time in answer to a question about the WWE writings creative staff. I think with either the WWE writers or with Dixie Carter, I would need either 5 minutes to say hello or 5 years. Anything in between probably wouldn't do any of us any good. You can't learn wrestling just because somebody says, well, here's the way it ought to be. It takes years. You have to live it. You have to experience it. You have to have seen the good and the bad, understand understand what works and what doesn't. Been a performer, been in front of crowds, been in a variety of situations. Yeah, wrestling is very cyclical. It repeats itself. And people who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And I've seen it over and over and over again.
If you had to make a bet, if TNA, aside from Russo, but if they just keep on the same path they're on now, do you think they'll be in business 3 to 4 years from now?
Oh, yeah. I think, TNA has gotten big enough now that even doing whatever it is that they're doing creatively, they're still going to make it. They're just not going to be anywhere close to Vince McMahon, or they're not going to get, let's face it, Vince Russo's been writing a television program for 3 years. And in 3 years, they've gotten better deals from Spike TV, which has artificially bumped up their ratings. They had 11 o'clock p.m. time slot. When they got moved to 9, of course, more people watched. Then they got 2 hours, so more people watched. But when you take those things into account, their ratings have basically stayed flat. And since the 2-hour time, they've stayed mostly flat. They go from a 0.9 to a 1.3 or somewhere in the middle, depending on who's on vacation that week. And nobody buys the pay-per-view. Because I'm not trying to harp on it, but Vince Russo does not understand how to make matchups between stars that people will pay to see. He just understands, put everything out there for free, make sure it doesn't last too long, and get to the next thing. And so as a result, they have not grown as I thought they should have. And see, unfortunately, as WCW bore out, it didn't go that far in the WWF because Vince McMahon wouldn't let it. But after you hotshot, and this goes back to the territory days, after you hotshot and hotshot and hotshot and never slow down, pretty soon you run off and leave the fans, and they don't come back. Nothing resonates, nothing registers. They don't understand things. They don't care. It becomes apathy. And also you can't top it. What do you top that with? You can't. Continually trying to top yourself leads to burnout. Hot-shotting leads to burnout. So when Vince Russo is finished booking a wrestling company, whoever follows him is severely damaged and handicapped because none of their tools work anymore. They've got burned through all the big matches in 4 minutes on free TV. They've not got any rules for anyone to break to get any heat. They don't have any credibility for the big matchups, or the results of the matches mean something. Basically, whoever follows something like Russo is handicapped to the point where even if they do the right things, it doesn't work anymore because all the logic has been taken out of the universe.
Well, it was proven with WCW because
in a big way, wasn't it?
Once he got in charge of WW and put the championship on himself and on David Arquette and all the other just screwball moves,
now, Gary, let's face it, they weren't doing too good without him because there weren't a lot of surgeons down there anyway. Bischoff went mad. He had an accidental epiphany of stealing an invasion angle from Japan and was able to silver-tongue Turner executives into buying a bunch of contracts and paying a bunch of guys a lot of money, and then they hot-shotted, and it popped, but then they were stuck in a position where even if they just drew twice as much money as most wrestling promotions ever had, then they would only kind of maybe lose a little bit of money. Yeah. What did the deal they made with Hogan? Every time they sold his T-shirt, they lost like $3. So they weren't doing very well on their own, but Russo and Ferrara were the ones that put the nail in the coffin because they just took that car that was hanging on the edge of the cliff and kicked the bumper in the back, and over it went. And there was no way to pick it up or catch it.
Yeah, I know. It seems like they enjoy doing it. I don't understand why they're given the opportunity. The Detroit Lions gave a television commentator, Matt Millen, an opportunity to run their franchise in total disarray when Owenstein last year, and Millen has many more credentials someone like a Russo or Ferrara would have, and yet they continue to get opportunities. I don't understand it.
I have asked many people in professional wrestling the answer, or that same question that has been asked to me, and actually the emails I get, basically it's always phrased, why in the flying F does Vince Russo have a job in the wrestling business? Nobody. People that have worked in companies with him alongside him can still not explain how he's able to do it. But in some way, for a guy who cannot sell a ticket, he can sell himself, and he can. It's sort of like when Eric Bischoff made up his resume to get hired by Turner Broadcast. He had been a coffee boy and a C-team announcer for Vern Gagne, but he convinced the Turner Broadcasting executives that because he had sold a game show idea for developmental in Hollywood, he was a real television person, and he had all these credentials, and they believed him, and they gave him the job. Vince Russo...
Yeah, but Jim, there's a big difference, and that is at the time, Bischoff at least was fresh. He wasn't a proven failure.
He was fresh, but so was Howie the mailroom guy.
Yeah, I know, but he was fresh, so you have the excuse that, well, at least he's never failed. Russo, on the other hand, has failed repeatedly. It would be like a head coach, Owenstein, every year in football, and yet we're going to hire him for another job, another head coaching
job. But, Gary,
job.
You don't understand. It's always somebody else's fault. See, when he was in the WWF, it was, well, my ideas, of course, worked and led to the biggest boom in the history of wrestling. And Rock and Austin were there in the network quality television production facility, and Jim Ross, the greatest announcer in the history of wrestling, and et cetera, and Vince McMahon, the greatest promoter ever. But it was all my ideas. But then when I went to WCW, you see, he says, he couldn't get the stuff that he wanted to do on television because of standards and practices, because the TV network didn't want distasteful stuff like that on their air, and he just couldn't understand that. And so if only they'd gotten out of the way, and if only the wrestlers had done what he told them to do, and if only they hadn't relieved him of power a time or two and broken up his train of thought, if only somebody else hadn't screwed up his genius, and that's the same thing that happened with me. If only Cornette wasn't changing my finishes in TNA wrestling so that the wrestlers could actually perform them and they might make sense to the viewers, why then we'd be on top of the world. He convinces people of this somehow. It may be hypnosis. I'm not sure.
Jim, I don't blame him for giving those lines.
I don't blame him for trying, but I don't understand why people believe it.
Well, it's a whole country. You see a reflection entire country. The intelligence level of the entire United States dropped significantly, and that's why stuff like that is believed. Because I remember in the past days, if something was a proven failure, you were not rewarded with not only a new position, a higher position, but a raise and more power. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Or how about we ran this company out of business, so here we'll give the CEO $30 million to go away.
Yeah, I just don't understand it, Jim. Jim, look, I promised I'd keep you 30 minutes. You went over that. It's a real pleasure. Your website is www.jimcornette.com. I'd love to have you back on sometimes to talk about some of the classic days of wrestling. We're doing it with a lot of the greats from the past. You've got more knowledge than probably anyone for the past 30 years, and I just want to thank you for taking time.
Gary, I appreciate it, and I would be glad to come on sometime and talk about some classic wrestling, and I hope that everybody out there will not only go to my website, but also follow Ring of Honor on HDNet, because HDNet's TV of the future, and Ring of Honor is the wrestling of the future. It's something that I'm kind of proud to have my name associated with after all this time. If I can do anything to help them take the next step, I'm going to enjoy it. But HDNet, Ring of Honor over the next few months, I think is going to be the best wrestling program on the air.
Well, God help Vince if you ever get Mark Cuban really interested in pro wrestling, because he's got more greenbacks than Vince will ever dream of having. So,
well, I'll tell you, he's a real billionaire instead of just one on paper, because he managed to scam people into buying stock.
You got it, Jim. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gary.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.